UFC Fight Night, Allen versus Curtis 2, full card predictions. Starting at the bottom of the card, making my way to the top as always. This card, frankly, isn't as good or anywhere close to as good as UFC 300. UFC 300, I'll probably talk about that one for well over an hour. This one will be a lot shorter because there's not as many great fights and a lot of newcomers as far as Dana White Contender Series fighters making their debuts. First fight of the night, though, Melissa Mullins versus Nora Cornoli. Both of them missed weight. Melissa weighed in 138, and 138 and a half was what Nora weighed in at. Neither one's going to have an advantage because they both missed weight by 2.5 pounds respectively. So, you know, I'm going to go with Melissa Mullins here, who I was originally going to pick anyway, because Mullins is the better grappler, and I think that's all it really comes down to in this one. I think Nora is clearly, I would say she's clearly the better striker. Melissa got dropped in her fight against Arina Alexieva in round one. She got dropped pretty badly, but she did recover quick and ended up getting that win. And I think Melissa Mullins has shown that she can grapple. And Nora Cornoli, on the other hand, got out grappled. Jocelyn Edwards had about, 8 minutes of control time. So I think this one's pretty simple. Melissa Mullins gets the takedowns, possibly gets a submission, but at the very least gets enough control time to beat Nora Cornoli. Moving along, we have Dylan Budka versus Cesar Almeida. This is one where I'm kind of stumped a little bit. 24-year-old Dylan Budka versus the 36-year-old Almeida. I'm going to go with Budka just because I think he's a more well-rounded fighter, and he's also 12 years younger. I think that could add a little bit in as well. If you look at the fact that Budka can make constant improvements only being 24, he could look a lot better than his last fight. He last fought 6 months ago. He probably will make massive improvements from that fight to this fight. On the other hand, you have Cesar Almeida, who I get it. Everyone's going to bring up his fight against Alex Pereira in kickboxing, right? He's 36, but he fought Alex Pereira in kickboxing 3 times, the last of which was 2015. So 9 years ago, he fought him in kickboxing. I think Almeida's probably out of his prime here. I'm not saying he's washed up or anything because he's only 4-0 in MMA, but he's 36 years old. He's late to the party as far as MMA goes. He got taken down on the Contender Series. Now, I know he beat Lucas Fernando, but he got taken down a few times. I think Budka could probably work in the grappling, work in the wrestling, and he has to do that. I don't expect him to have a ton of success striking. I think if he's smart, he'll mix in the grappling, be able to get Cesar Almeida down to the mat, and be able to beat him that way. Now, Almeida, sure, he does have the power threat. He does have the striking threat in general, but his 4 wins in MMA, Lucas Fernando was the only good, decent, guy he's beaten. Everyone else had negative records, 0-0 opponent, 0-0, and then a 5-28 Danilo Souza. So I got to go with Dylan Budka. I know he hasn't fought like amazing competition in his own right. The Azamat Bekoev fight, I watched that back. He was getting outstruck a little bit in that fight. Couldn't really get a lot of takedowns there, but that's a guy that's 15-3. 15-3 Russian, training out of American Top Team. I don't think Almeida's going to have that same level of wrestling and grappling. I will take Dylan Budka to win in this one. Third fight of the night is Gene Matsumoto versus Dan Argueta. I'm just going to tell you guys what. This card, I'm going to pick quite a few underdogs, so we'll see how this card goes. This is the first underdog I'm picking. I'm going with Dan Argueta. I don't think Matsumoto is as good as his record indicates. He's 14-0. He's 24 years old as well, so that can show people that he has a lot of room for improvement. He can keep getting better and better. But I just look at him, and when you look at the guy, he doesn't look like he's 14-0. He doesn't look like an undefeated prospect. I mean, he's not that great. I really don't think he's that great. I think he's got plenty of time. As I mentioned, he's only 24. He's got years and years in his career left. So that's the good news for him. But the bad news is Dan Argueta, he hasn't fought a wrestler like Dan Argueta. I feel like Argueta, honestly, has fought guys like Matsumoto before. Dan Argueta has beaten some Brazilians in LFA with similar records to Matsumoto. If you really look back further on his record, I do believe Dan Argueta hasn't beaten undefeated 12-0 Myron Santos. So that's the thing with Argetta. You have to take his wrestling seriously because he can out wrestle guys. His last two fights, I know he did not get the better of Miles Johns. Miles Johns ended up winning that fight. It was declared a no contest because Johns tested positive for something. But the fight before that destroyed Ronnie Lawrence. Would have won the fight, in my opinion. I mean, he got to mount and he had the guillotine. Even if he wasn't going to finish the fight there, I think he would have won eventually anyway. Nick Aguirre out wrestled, and Nick Aguirre is a grappler. So Nick Aguirre is a grappler. He out grappled him. Nick Aguirre did have his back for a moment in round one, but for the most part, it was Argetta just taking him down and controlling him. And then obviously the loss to Damon Jackson. I don't hold that too much against him. Short notice loss to Damon Jackson, where Dan Argetta had some success in round three. So all in all, I just don't like. And if you look at Matsumoto's record, if you really look through it, I know he's 14-0, but look at some of the guys he's fighting. A lot of the guys he's fighting are 2-0, 1-0, 1-0, 0-0, all the way up here, and then 10-8, and then finally his last 5 or 6 fights, he's fighting decent opponents and he's getting wins. He's getting wins over Casey Tanner, and a few of these, but they're not the competition he's fighting. It's solid competition. I'm not saying it's bad. It's solid competition, but it's not anything amazing. So could Gene Matsumoto stop the takedowns and outstrike Dan Argetta? It's not impossible. I definitely think Matsumoto is the superior striker to Argetta, but I don't think Matsumoto has extreme power. I don't think he knocks out Argetta. And if I think Argetta can get takedowns and mix things up and keep it close, I'll take the underdog, the plus 135, Dan Argetta. The line has been closing. Matsumoto was, I think, minus 200, minus 220. Now the line is down to minus 160 on him. I think that's because people are realizing that, sure, he is undefeated. He is a good fighter, but he's fighting a guy that has a skill set that he's never been up against before. So I'll take Dan Argetta in this one and get it done. I also like the UFC experience of Dan. Pedro Falcaio versus Victor Hugo. Going to be honest, not much. I mean, both guys are making their debut. It's a short notice fight for Pedro, but I'm going with Pedro. I'm going with Pedro to beat Victor Hugo, and the reason is I think Victor Hugo. He's one of these guys at Astra Fight Team, and if you look through Astra Fight Team, if you look at all of their fighters, I believe they have a lot of Simon Oliveira's one, and who's the other one? I'm not sure if I'm able to find them now, but they have guys like that. I don't think Astra Fight Team is really that legit. I really don't. And part of the reason is, I mean, Simon Oliveira, what is his game? Just, Hail Mary guillotines. He loves to go in for the guillotine. What's Victor Hugo's game? Needs to push the grappling. That's what he wants to do. And against a guy like Pedro Falcaio, I know it's short notice. So could Pedro, not look the greatest on a few days' notice, making his UFC debut? It's not impossible, but speaking of Victor Hugo, I was picking against him in the fight against Alatong Haley. I was going to pick against him, and he had a canceled fight against Daniel Marcos. I would have picked Daniel Marcos in that fight. So this makes 3 for 3. I'm picking against him again. I'm going with Pedro. I do think again, it's another guy from Brazil, Victor Hugo, who I think his record is inflated. Pedro Falcaio, he's never been submitted. He's 5-0 to the submission, 5 submission wins, no submission losses. He's fighting out of Nova União. So and by the way, it's not just Nova União. That's where he was fighting out of. I checked his Instagram. He's now fighting out of Extreme Couture. So he's been getting training in at Extreme Couture for like the last month, maybe a few months. So he's been training at a really good gym in Extreme Couture versus Victor Hugo, a guy who is going to go for knee bars and leg locks and stuff. I'll take Pedro, and Pedro just had a boxing fight not too long ago. So he's not just a grappler. He's rounding out his game. I'm taking Pedro. I know it's short notice, but I didn't like what I saw. I don't like guys that go for knee bars and heel hooks, especially against other guys that can grapple. When you go up against guys that can grapple well, like Pedro, you're going to get exposed, and I think that's what happens. So I'll take Pedro, another underdog on the card. Moving along, does this make 3 in a row? Do I dare pick Jermaine Durandamy at 39 years old, about to be 40, coming off of a 3.5-year layoff? Am I crazy enough to pick Jermaine Durandamy is the question. Yes, I am. I am going to pick Jermaine Durandamy, and most people are picking Dumont, 67%. I get why people are picking Dumont, and the line's closed. Dumont was like a minus 180, I believe. Now she's minus 125. You're barely getting plus money on Durandamy. The reason I'm picking Durandamy, third underdog in a row, by the way, so like I said, we'll see how this card goes. But the reason I'm picking Jermaine Durandamy, excuse me, is because she's a better striker in my opinion. I don't like Norma Dumont striking. Sure, she'll throw hard and she does have kind of vicious intentions when she does throw, but I don't really like her overall game or her lack or how do you say it? Her opponents, I should say, her opponents are not very good compared to Jermaine Durandamy's. Durandamy has fought the much superior competition. It's not even a debate whatsoever. If you look at Norma Dumont's last five out, and you know what? Let's not even look at the last five out. Let's just look at her entire UFC career. Her entire UFC career, she gets into the UFC and gets knocked out in the first round by Megan Anderson. She was only 4-0 at the time, but regardless, getting knocked out by Megan Anderson, never a good look, especially in round one. She beat Ashley Evans Smith, Felicia Spencer by split, Aspen Ladd. She lost a split to Macy Chasson, beat Danielle Wolf, who was 1-0, Carol Rosa, who dropped her, by the way, in round two. Carol Rosa dropped her on her ass. And then Chelsea Chandler, she beat Chelsea Chandler. That was a fight where Chandler turned and ran the opposite way into the other end of the cage. So the problem with Jermaine Durandamy, I believe, is the layoff. That's really the only concern I have with Durandamy because I think she's she is a much better striker. I think that's clear. She has a clear striking edge, I believe. And even in the grappling, I don't think Norma Dumont's going to be able to take her down and get a lot of top control time. Will she push her up against the fence? Probably. She might get some cage control, but if Jermaine Durandamy is landing good strikes, especially if she can get a knockdown, if Carol Rosa can do it, why can't Jermaine Durandamy? I don't care if she's been off for 3 years. If Carol Rosa can knock you down, why can't a former champion, a girl in Durandamy who's fought, beat Juliana Pena, round 3 submission, lost to Amanda Nunes, who did take her down a lot of times, but it's Amanda Nunes, beat Aspen Ladd in like 20 seconds, beat Raquel Pennington, and then beat Holly Holm. These are all top level women in the division. I don't care that she's taken this much time off. Usually, if I see that someone's taken 2-3 years off, I almost never pick them. This could be, in hindsight, this could look terrible because I usually don't pick fighters that are coming off of long layoffs like this. But I think this is a case where you got on one hand, you have a former champion who really is an amazing fighter, amazing striker, only lost the best in the UFC. I think she has a 7-2 record in the UFC as well. Her only losses being 7-2 record in the UFC, only losses being to Amanda Nunes. She beat, like I said, Pena, Pennington, Holm. She even beat Larissa Pacheco. She has some really good wins on her record. I don't think Norma Dumont's wins come close in comparison. So as long as Jermaine Durandamy isn't completely washed up, I think she can edge out a decision win here. Lastly, we have the headliner of the prelims. We have Court McGee versus Alex Morono. McGee versus Morono. I'm going to be taking Alex Morono. And for me, it's a fact of Court McGee getting knocked out twice in his last two fights and being 39 years old. The difference between McGee and Jermaine Durant, well, I shouldn't even have to even compare the two. I think most people understand why I would consider picking Jermaine Durandamy compared to picking someone like McGee. The reason I'm not picking McGee is because obviously he's been knocked out twice. He's shown signs of decline. For Durandamy, I know she's been off for 3 years. I know there's a ton of concern, but she hasn't shown a bad chin. She hasn't shown that she's, not in it anymore. So if she comes back and she shows she's not in it, whatever. But until then, I got to pick her against someone like Norma Dumont. But in this one, I am going to pick Alex Morono because I do think Alex Morono is good enough to beat most unranked 170 pounders. I really do. I think he's good enough to beat most guys at welterweight, Court McGee being one of them. His last fight was against Joaquin Buckley. We saw what Buckley did to Luque, and Buckley's now a ranked fighter. Morono beats him means, lost to Santiago Ponzinibbio, a fight where he was winning up until the third round where he got knocked out. He got clipped, and then he beat Semmelsberger and Mickey Gall to round out his last five opponents. For Court McGee, lost to Carlos Condit, beat Claudio Silva and Ramiz Brahimaj. Those wins haven't really aged well. You could say the same about Mickey Gall, and then the last two, though, the two knockout losses, the Matt Brown, Jeremiah Wells. The Matt Brown fight, it It was a short right hook, and he was basically done. One punch, didn't need a follow up from Matt Brown. Matt Brown is the immortal. He is a vicious fighter. I got a lot of respect for Matt Brown and what he's overcame in his career just to get to where he's at. But at the end of the day, Matt Brown is also a guy that's 40, 41 years old, a guy who is out of his prime, and a guy who knocked out Court McGee. I think Alex Murno could probably do the same thing. Not that Alex Murno is known to have a ton of power, but I do believe he will touch the chin of Court McGee. And I think Court McGee is one of those guys where at this point in his career, he got knocked out twice. I think his chin's gone. I think it's really deteriorated. And if Morono catches him once, I think it can be the fight. So give me Alex Morono by KO. Main card, opening up the main card, we have Trevor Peek versus Charlie Campbell. I was originally thinking, I don't know if I should pick Peek because Campbell. I was thinking about Campbell because he's the better technical striker. He's probably the better fighter overall in terms of just technique, obviously. But then I looked at his fights, right? And Charlie Campbell, he hasn't been the distance since 2021, where he won a decision against 2-0 Cedric Gunnison. Pretty much all of his fights since then, I know he's had some grappling. He's been grappling a little bit, but his actual fights, he beat Alex Reyes in round one, beat Josh Streaker in round one, lost to Chris Duncan in round one. He rocked Chris Duncan bad, almost had him out of there, but then got knocked out himself. And if you look through his record, most of his last few fights for the last few years, 2, 3, 4 years, have all been round one fights, have all been over quickly. I know Trevor Peek's a madman. I know Trevor Peek is crazy. He throws standing hammer fists. He throws, a bunch of unorthodox stuff. But at the end of the day, Peek, he's not a quitter. He can go 3 rounds. We've seen him go 3 rounds multiple times. I know he lost to Chepe Mariscal. I know he lost to him, but the fact that he went 3 rounds to Chepe, it was a good experience for him getting those 3 rounds in the UFC. Obviously, he slowed down a little bit, but he still was pressing. He didn't give up on himself, even when he was getting tagged with clean shots. And then the fight against Muhammad Yahya, he went the distance with him as well. So I think Peek has had the UFC experience going, had more cage time in the UFC, has been 15 minutes his last 2 fights. I think he knows what it's like to go to 15 now. I think he can pace himself better. I think Peek, I know he's an unfinished product, but I think he's one of those guys where if he does land once clean on Campbell, he could really hurt him bad. Campbell could be winning most of the fight and get knocked out by Peek. Yeah, I'm saying all of this just to say I like Trevor Peek in this fight. Obviously, technique, like I said, technique goes to Charlie Campbell. If you just look at their technical strike, if you break down their technical striking and just look at it, you're going to obviously pick Charlie Campbell, and you're going to say Charlie Campbell is going to outclass Trevor Peek and make it look easy. I understand why someone would say that, and I'm not saying that's impossible because Charlie Campbell could be winning most of this fight or all of it, but I do think there is a very good possibility if Chris Duncan can flatline Charlie Campbell, and I mean flatlined him. He dropped him and then followed up with one punch. He was out. Campbell was out cold. You're telling me Trevor Peek can't find a moment where he lands a big right hand or standing hammer fist that rocks Campbell, and then, I just feel like in a dogfight, in a fight where both guys are going to be swinging back and forth, I'm taking the guy in Trevor Peek that has a better chin, better durability, and a guy that probably has more power. Now, I know Charlie Campbell's been knocking guys out, but if you look at his knockout wins, I mean, Alex Reyes was off for 7 years coming back? He was off for like 7 years before that fight, and Charlie Campbell should have, got him out of there in round 1 like he should have. Then he beat some guys. He knocked out some guys on the regional scene, similar to what Trevor Peek did on the regional scene. So ultimately, I think this is kind of a coin flip fight more so than not, just because, sure, Campbell is the superior striker on paper, but when you look at a fight doesn't always come down to who's better on paper. It comes down to who has more heart, who's more determined to go after it in rounds 2 and 3. And I think Peek is a guy that will never quit on himself. So I'll go with Trevor Peek to get this one done. Next up on the main card, we have Lucas Presky versus Walter Walker. I'm going with Walter Walker. I didn't like Walter Walker's old tape that he had, the fight. I watched against, well, really, I don't like his striking in general. I'll just say that. I know he has 6 KO TKO wins. His striking, in my opinion, is very, I'm just gonna say it's bad. It's not polished. Tries to throw a lot of knees. He's just kind of slow on the feet, in my opinion. He's Johnny Walker's brother. If you didn't catch that, or if you didn't know, but like I said, I just don't think Walker is great on the feet. But I do think he has the ability to take down Lucas Bresky. I do think he can take Lucas Bresky down multiple times. Lucas Bresky was taken down 8 times, 8 or 9 times by Carl Williams, who is a good wrestler. Don't get me wrong, he is a very good wrestler for heavyweight. But at the end of the day, if you're getting taken down 8 or 9 times by Carl Williams, what's to say Walter Walker can't take you down a few times at least? You know what I mean? What's to say he can't take you down a few times? So I do think Walter Walker will get some takedowns. Against Alex Nicholson, he out wrestled him the entire fight, had a ton of takedowns there, just kept shooting. He showed good cardio in that one. And like I said, for Lucas Bresky, his last 3 beat Dylan Potter on the Contender Series. That one was overturned because he tested positive. He has 3 losses. He should have beaten Martin Buday. He should have won that fight. That was pretty clear robbery, in my opinion. Martin Buday sucks, though, so it's not impressive even if he did win. And then his last 2, Carl Williams and Waldo Cortez Acosta, got knocked out by Cortez Acosta and lost to Carl Williams, got dominated there. So I am going to pick Walter Walker. I am going to pick him just to out wrestle Lucas Bresky. On the feet, could be competitive, but I do think Walker can get some takedowns here. Next fight on the main card, I believe this is the featured fight of the night. No, it is not. One away. Ignacio Bahamondes versus Christos Giagos. I'm going to go with Ignacio Bahamondes here to beat Christos Giagos. Giagos is always dangerous early. He always has a chance early, but Giagos, you just can't trust him, especially against an up-and-coming guy like Ignacio Bahamondes, 26 years old. For Bahamondes, I feel like he is a real prospect, heavy favorite, of course, and probably deserves to be. I think the books have been they technically, for the most part, they've been right on Christos Giagos. For the most part, they really have gotten Christos Giagos fights correctly. The Daniel Zellhuber fight, Zellhuber finished Giagos. He was a minus 290 favorite. Ricky Glenn won. Ricky Glenn was a slight favorite against Giagos. That one was where the books got it wrong. But every other fight, Moises was a pretty heavy favorite, minus 240 against him. Arman Tsarukyan was like minus 800. Made it look easy in that one. So for the most part, the books, Sean Soriano beat him as a minus 225. So the books kind of understand what they're getting from Giagos. He can beat the guys that aren't on this next level, but the guys that have a serious future possible top 15 guys, if you're a top 15 guy, you're beating Christos Giagos. This is a good test for Ignacio Bahamondes. His last fight, he did lose to Ludovic Klein. No shame in losing to Ludovic Klein. I think Ludovic Klein is a very good fighter and a very improved fighter as well. So not going to take anything away from that one. And then his other loss was to John McDessie in his first fight in the UFC. He has 3 wins in between. Beat Trey Ogden, Rong Zhu, and Roosevelt Roberts. I think he could add a guy like Christos Giagos to the list. Giagos 6-7 in the UFC. A lot of his UFC wins are against guys that are no longer in the promotion or guys that haven't fared well in the UFC. So I am going to go with a guy in Ignacio Bahamondes, training also with Bilal Muhammad, great training partner over there. When you're getting training in with a guy as smart and as has such a high fight IQ like Bilal, that'll definitely rub off onto Ignacio. So I'm picking Ignacio to win this one. Now we're off to the featured fight, and it's Morgan Charrier versus Chepe Mariscal. And it's interesting. It's interesting because this is a very close line. Morgan Charrier was a much heavier favorite earlier in the week. Now the line has come all the way down, and Chepe Mariscal is only plus 100. The problem I have with Chepe Mariscal is, if you look at this, he's been finished 3 times. So durability is a bit of a question just because he's been finished 3 times. Morgan Charrier has never been finished. He is 11-0 to the knockout. The guy is a very good striker. I think if this plays out on the feet, which I do expect it to play out on the feet, Morgan will end up winning this fight. I do think Chepe is good. He showed that he's good in his last two fights, first 2 fights in the UFC. Took a short notice fight against Trevor Peek. And Peek, he beat Trevor Peek pretty convincingly too. He won that one 30-27, so that was a solid win, especially on short notice. But then his fight after that was against Jack Jenkins. Jenkins was ahead on the numbers in round one. Round two, he got injured. I know you could say, oh, it was a result of Chepe. Chepe was the one that got Jack injured. You could say that, but at the end of the day, he got hurt. You know, say what you will, he got hurt. It wasn't like a submission knockout. He broke his arm. So, you know, if that fight would play out for 15 minutes, would Chepe Mariscal win? Maybe, but it was shaping up. It was shaping to be a close fight. Anyway, now for Charrier, a lot of people are picking Mariscal here. It's actually close to even, but more people on the Mariscal side. I get it. I understand it because he has won two fights in the UFC. He has his out of UFC experience. If you look at his LFA experience, just all of his experience in general, he has fought some really good competition. He lost to Steve Garcia, Joe Anderson Brito, beat Yusuf Salah back in 2019, which is a very well aging win. Lost to Bryce Mitchell, had a no contest against Carl Deaton. Pat Sabatini beat by split. So he's won a lot of fights, or not won. He's been in a lot of fights against high level competition. But I think Morgan's also been in fights with high level competition. Not his last one necessarily, but if you look through Morgan's record, he's fought decent. He's fought pretty good guys in Cage Warriors. Cage Warriors has some good fighters, and Morgan's fought. You know, I'd say he's fought a pretty good level of competition himself. And I think, like I said, if this fight plays out on the feet, I do think Morgan probably is able to outstrike Chepe Mariscal and win this fight. The durability, more of a concern on the Chepe side, a lot less of a concern on the Morgan side. And in a fight where I think where the line is minus 120 to plus 100, almost even, I'll take the guy who I know could go 3 rounds, has more KO potential, and I don't think Mariscal is going to sub or have a ton of grappling success against Morgan either. So I will take Morgan to get it done. Also, the French have had a good amount of success lately outside of Benoit Saint Denis. They have had, obviously, the Menefuro fight last weekend. Great look for France there. I think the success can continue on. Co-main event of the evening, we have Alexander Hernandez versus Damon Jackson. I'm going with Alexander Hernandez. He missed weight by 5 pounds. He weighed in at 150, and as it shows there, 150. Jackson weighed in 146. I think that'll help Hernandez. Hernandez missed weight by a ton. It's like he didn't even try to get down all the way to 46. I have to go with Hernandez just because of that. It's a 4-pound weight advantage. Plus, he's already the bigger guy, I believe. He's fought at 55 multiple times. Alexander Hernandez actually has knocked out guys at 55. Plus, Damon Jackson is a guy who you can't trust his cardio in over 3 rounds. Jackson slowed down. I know people like to say that Hernandez is a notorious gasser, but if you think Hernandez is a notorious gasser, you also think Jackson's a notorious gasser. They both get tired in round 3. Jackson was tired. He was tired in round 3 against Dan Argueta, and Argueta was on short notice in that one, and Argueta took it to him in the 3rd round. So yeah, I think Alexander Hernandez can win this fight. I know he got finished by where is it? He got finished by Billy Q a year ago. He hasn't had a ton of success, really any success at 145 yet. But I think this is a good matchup for him. Damon Jackson doesn't present too much problems on the feet. He's more of a grappler. Alexander Hernandez is a black belt. I don't see him getting submitted by Damon Jackson unless he just gets completely winded and Jackson somehow takes advantage. But I don't think Jackson's a guy that pushes a pace incredibly. So on the feet, I favor Hernandez. On the mat, I'd say I favor Jackson, but not like super, super heavily favor Jackson because Hernandez does also have a black belt. So I'll go with Alexander Hernandez, also because of the weight miss and being a few years younger, 31 to the 35-year-old Damon Jackson. Although, as I said, Hernandez hasn't had a ton of success at 145, so hopefully this is a turnaround for him. And lastly, we have the main event of the evening. It is Brendan Allen versus Chris Curtis, Part 2. Part 1, Chris Curtis knocked out Brendan Allen, knocked him out, and I don't think that happens again. Chris Curtis has gotten a few years older since that fight. Brendan Allen is coming into his prime now. The last time they fought was in 2021 in December. Chris Curtis, 34 years old, to the 25-year-old Brendan Allen. I think this is a different fight. I think Curtis is a little bit on the decline. I think Curtis has shown that he's not that he's completely fallen off, obviously, but he hasn't shown that he's on the same level anymore. I think Brendan Allen's going to show him levels here. I think Brendan Allen is going to um, kind of write off on all the doubters, people that said, including me. I picked against Brendan Allen before. I'm not going to lie. I have picked against him in previous fights, but this one I do think he wins. Chris Curtis, short notice fight for him, which I don't think really matters too much because I think Curtis he can go 5 rounds if he needs to. He's always training, but he's one dimensional. That's the problem. Brendan Allen's more well rounded. I think on the feet, obviously, Brendan Allen could get chinned by Chris Curtis because Curtis has really good boxing. But outside of the boxing, I don't think Curtis has a lot for Brendan Allen. I think Allen's more well rounded. I think he could stick and move on the outside. We've seen Curtis in his last few fights. Jack Hermanson and Kelvin Gastelum and even Imavov were all beating him just by outstriking. I know Imavov had some takedowns, but Gastelum and Jack Hermanson, they outstruck him. They were moving around on the outside, didn't get touched by Curtis, and they beat him pretty cleanly. The fact that Hermanson, the fact that Gastelum, the fact that all these guys are able to have that sort of success on him. Even Marc-Andre Barrios took him to a split. I think that was a clear win for Curtis, but it was a competitive enough fight. I think Brendan Allen's gotten a lot better striking. I think his striking, he'll be able to hang with Curtis on the feet. Obviously, if he starts boxing with him, that's stupid. But if he moves around on the outside, throws some kicks, tries to mix in the wrestling, mix in the grappling, I do think he can have success there. And if the fight hits the mat, I think Brendan Allen it's basically Brendan Allen's world when it hits the mat. I think his grappling is on another level compared to Chris Curtis. Curtis has good takedown defense, but if he slips once, if Allen times a nice takedown, gets him down, I do think he'll have, like I said, a ton of success there. So I am going to take Brendan Allen in the rematch in the main event. And there it is, UFC Fight Night, Allen versus Curtis 2. I have quite a few underdogs on this card. This is another tricky card. Last week was tricky. One of my worst cards ever last week. Hopefully we can bounce back this week. But UFC 300, that video is going to be probably my longest video ever. I'm going to be talking about UFC 300 for a long time. But this one, just try and get it out of the way. Wait until next week. But thank you guys very much for watching. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.